Now, this is the fifth video in a series of 7 in which we're looking at the 7 deadly sins. And the 7 deadly sins are pride, greed, gluttony, envy, anger, sloth. And there's another one I've forgotten.
I wasn't paying attention to you.
Lust! It was lust!
Was it lust?
How could I forget that? Pride, greed, gluttony, lust, envy, anger, and sloth. And joining me once again is my good friend Ryan Brom, pastor of the Christian Reformed Church in beautiful Brighton, Ontario, Canada.
So today we'll be looking at the sin of envy. And envy, I think, is quite prevalent in our world today. Much of our marketing and advertisement is really based on envy. And also, even when it comes to social opinions or looking at each other's social status, there's a fair bit of envy about what kind of views we should have and what kind of positions we should take.
Now, there's an old Russian story about 2 poor peasants who were neighbors, and late one winter, one of those poor peasants fell to his knees in the snow and began to pray in earnest. He prayed day after day after day until one morning in the early spring, an angel appeared before him asking what he wanted. And the poor peasant said to the angel that he wanted a cow. And so, poof, the angel gave him a cow. And over the course of that year, the fortunes of that poor peasant changed dramatically. With the milk, he was able to sell it for profit. With the cow herself, he was able to plow more acreage, sow more seed, and have a much larger crop. Now, his success didn't escape the envious glare of his neighbor, who knew that it was because of the cow that his neighbor was so successful. And so, the following winter, he too fell on his knees in the snow and began to pray in earnest. He prayed day after day after day, until finally, early in the spring one morning, the exact same angel appeared before him asking what he wanted. And the poor peasant said to the angel, "I want you to go over to my neighbors and kill that damn cow." So often with envy, we think it means wanting what other people have, to covet what other people have. But sometimes it goes even further than that. It can also mean desiring to have the success of that person, or have that person, him or herself, destroyed. Now, I don't know the origins of that story, but it certainly described well what took place in the Russian countryside in the late 1920s and early 30s. There was a class amongst the peasantry known as the kulaks. They were the more successful peasants. Now, while some of them ended up becoming quite wealthy, the vast majority of kulaks, though, it just simply meant they had a few more cows, a few more acres than the average peasant. And the reason for their success was largely due to the fact that, well, they were the more competent peasants. They knew how to farm better. They worked harder and they worked smarter. But according to communist ideology, which had taken hold of Russia during that time, the reason allegedly for their success, though, was due to exploitation. That they had stolen the meager resources that their fellow peasants had and were hoarding them all to themselves. Now, what you need to realize about the kulaks is that the kulaks to communism were what the Jews were to Nazism. They were considered the parasites of society. They were the bloodsuckers. They were blamed for all of society's ills, all of its inequalities. And so, just like the Jews, they were rounded up by the millions, crammed into boxcars and sent off to labor camps in Siberia, where millions of them died. But the tragedy didn't end there. Because what do you think happened when the more competent peasants were taken out of the equation? The result was mass famine. And over the course of the next several years, millions of the poorest of the peasants died from starvation. Envy is one of the 7 deadly sins. And in that situation, envy proved literally to be deadly.
And that story that Mark shared about the kulaks, unfortunately, is not an isolated story in the history of humanity. Throughout the pages of history books, we can see repeatedly one people group blaming another people group for the disadvantages that they are experiencing. And this goes right back to the very beginning, and I mean the very beginning of history, when we look at Cain and Abel. Cain blamed Abel because Abel received favor from the Lord. And instead of Cain looking at himself to see how can I better my relationship with the Lord, he blamed Abel and ultimately decided, I need to kill him. Now, before Cain executed his plan, the Lord graciously gave him an opportunity to reconsider the plot that he was about to execute out of his envy. And here's what Genesis 4 says. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Have you ever wondered what exactly was the Lord meaning when he said to Cain, "If you do what is right"? What is that? To do what is right? So to answer that question, I'm going to turn to the Gospel of John, John chapter 21. In this it says, Peter turned and he saw the disciple that Jesus loved was following them. This was the one that had leaned against Jesus' back at the supper and said, "Lord, who's going to betray you?" And when Peter saw him, he asked, "Jesus, what about him?" Jesus answered, "Well, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." In those words that Jesus was saying there, doing what is right is not looking sideways at your brother or your sister, but instead it's focusing your eyes to what God has called you to do. That God has given you an allotment and a portion, and you can't be insisting that someone else's allotment and portion must be yours, or that they must have your allotment and portion. Instead, doing what is right is looking upward to your Father in heaven and trusting in Him alone for what is good. So to move that forward into today's culture, there's a lot of virtue signaling in which people are looking sideways at the way others are acting and whether their allotment is what's considered the right allotment or the wrong allotment. And there's this massive push to channel everyone in our culture down the same path. And as that happens, you can see tons of blame happening everywhere within our culture. These people are the problem. Those people that act this way are the problem. And at the heart of it is not only just hatred for others, it's envy. I want what those people have. They're the problem. I'm going to get rid of them. That Abel hated Cain because Cain had something. No, I got that completely backwards. It was Cain who hated Abel. What was the Lord asking of Abel, Cain, crap, there? So to answer that question, what is the question? And so the sixth sin in the list of the 7 deadly sins is anger.
And because someone is going away next week on vacation with his family,
We'll just take a pause for a couple of weeks on the 7 deadly sins, and we'll pick it up again in 2 weeks.
and in the meantime, next week I'll be going solo and putting out a video on Genesis 1:1. You won't want to miss that. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you haven't already, please do consider subscribing.
And clicking on some end cards that are over this really depressed, dejected face, because he just made a blooper and he doesn't know what to do with it. So thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks, but make sure you watch Mark next week.
We could do that.